I just want to welcome everyone again to our webinar on deer resistant gardening with Emily Hatfield, a local gardener. She has a lot of great information to present and hopefully will help us all have a little bit more of a sense of what we can plant in our gardens that will work and that the deer won't like. So thanks all for joining us. Thanks so much, Emily. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it. Yeah, the deer do not read the list. That is correct. So I have been a landscape designer and a gardener, taking care of many different maintenance gardens in Marin for 24 years now. So my deer resistant knowledge really comes from very specific gardens where I've had to deal with really high pressure of deer in the area, depending upon the location, like anywhere from up on Panoramic in Mill Valley to Kent Woodlands or Belvedere, where we were gardening, big landscapes without any fencing for varying reasons. So I don't have a wildlife biology background. I have a gardening background. So I don't know a lot about the specific species of deers. If you're interested in that, that's not my area of expertise. But I do have a lot of, practical knowledge that comes from just having to be the expert for other people's deer problems for many years. So I just want to kind of give you that caveat, but I'm open to a lot of questions at the end. So I think that we'll all probably learn from our varying garden situations because they're all so specific, to where you live and what the deer are there to browse and what time of year they're there and how you plant around those parameters. So just want to get into what the deer pressure means. It just means, do you have like specifically a deer family living nearby? Are they there using your property as their year-round habitat? Or is it like a seasonal thing that you have to deal with in the spring when all those new juicy plant leaves and buds are just coming out? Because that's like the delicacy of a deer, to obviously come and browse those fresh new leaves. Or is it that in the fall you have deer suddenly showing up because they're so desperate because we have a summer dry Mediterranean climate, and they have essentially the plants are their water source. So they come and end up eating things that maybe in previous earlier times of the year they would not eat, such as natives like Arctostaphylos or something that may be fine for most of the year. By the end of the year, they'll get less picky. And that's why the plant list thing doesn't always work. I've seen so many plant lists and I look at them and I'm like, what are they talking about? That's not true, because it depends on your area and it depends on how stressed the deer are or how many deer there are. So that's why I do think the Q&A will be interesting, because each of you has your own circumstances that you're dealing with. And, an urban or suburban garden is different than living up on Mount Tam, where maybe there's a deer track that runs right through your property and there's a seasonal stream that the deer have to go get to. So to a certain degree, when I say making friends, I don't mean that you will love them, because as a gardener, it is hard to love the animals who eat all of your hard work. And in such an irrational time, it just all of a sudden one night you'll walk out and they've raised a whole area that they previously didn't go after. So there's not a surefire way to protect your garden from deer except for a fence. And even that, depending upon the circumstances, again, of the topography, how many deer there are, if they're trying to get to a water source, they will jump the fence. So maybe for 5 years, your 6-foot fence worked really well. And then suddenly you come home and there's a deer family on your property and they've completely, eradicated your veggie garden. So I'll go into a little bit of that about fencing and how best to deal with that if you are trying to protect one area of your landscape very specifically from deer. But I do think it's important to remember that, this was their house and then we came and built our lives inside of their surroundings. So because they're, moving all the time, you can't necessarily expect that for a particular time of year, you're not suddenly going to get a little herd of deer that wants to come and hang out near your property. So that's why I think everybody's here taking the webinar, is that they've been hit, unsuspectingly all of a sudden. So I'm going to just kind of go through some of my very tried and true ways of getting around some of the what's the word? Just the unpredictability about what they're going to go after. So I do think fencing is not a bad thing. I think it just depends on how you utilize it. And if, especially I think for a lot of Marin folks, because we live in such a naturally beautiful place, and most of the people who live here, the reason they came here is because they want to be near the natural topography of this place. They don't want to live in suburbia or an urban area. So a lot of you, I think, probably have properties that are on the larger side. They're not necessarily very urban. So that means that you don't have those natural boundaries between properties where there's just fence lines that are protecting your whole garden. So then how do you use fencing? Where do you locate it where it feels natural and doesn't make it feel like you're cut off from all of the things that you love about Marin? And, I think you can make a really sweet little kind of veggie garden, or if it's an orchard or something that you're trying to grow for food, with a fence that looks very natural. Oftentimes people use transparent fencing, like the either rigid hog wire panels, or if they're just trying to get something growing tall enough that it is no longer in sort of the browsing height of a deer. So I don't know if you've ever seen deer stand on their hind legs, but unless they're really desperate, there's kind of a 5-foot height off the ground that they'll browse. So if you're trying to get like a little fruit tree scene going, they're not going to make it if they don't have any protection for the first few years. But then eventually you can not have protection. So we have used in the past, and it's not an eyesore, I don't think, if you take some of the tree stakes that you would normally use to secure a newly planted tree. We spray paint them black, and then we use the flexible black fencing that you can buy at Sloat in that flat plastic package. It's not super thick, but you just staple it to like 4 tree stakes around whatever that orchard tree is that you're starting. So you give it plenty of space to grow so that it's not growing through the fence. And the fence almost disappears, so you can really just protect that thing that needs protection temporarily. And then it's not a big commitment. There's no, posts in the ground with concrete, and then you can get rid of it once it's tall enough. So I think fencing can work. Another thing that I've learned over the years is that deer won't jump over something that they can't see the other side of. So if you have transparent fencing, just remember that especially if there's a slope or an elevation difference, if they can see over the top, they will for sure take a flying leap over a 6-foot fence. But if there's planting on the inside that obviously is protected by the fence, you can get a shorter fence and get a lot more protection, and they won't jump over it because they don't know what's over there. So that's something to think about too.
Emily, I just had a thing on fencing too, is like, I think that, like you were saying, where you can put the posts around and that sort of fabric fencing, which works really good and it's easy to deal with and whatnot. But do that while the plants are getting established, because those younger plants, I've had to do that with like olive trees, for example. and they just kept rubbing up against an olive tree, not even eating it, but just rubbing up against the tree. And so we put the fence around until the tree was strong enough on its own and had enough branching and whatnot that it wasn't going to be as affected. So
That's a good point. I have had gardens that were in really high deer pressure areas, like down near West Blythedale and Mill Valley, like near the creek, and obviously it's a wildlife corridor to get down to the water. And so then you would have bucks who are doing their weird, antler molting thing, and they would rub up against all the native planted shrubs that we had, like big arctostaphylos and manzanita, essentially manzanitas. And they would just do so much damage, way more than just, them browsing. So those are the two main kinds of damage that I feel like you kind of have to protect against. And it just depends on, it just depends on where you live, like how hardcore the deer are going to be about all the different life cycles that they're going through and what they need to do. So, that deer antler thing, that doesn't happen on everybody's property, but that was their home. We were in their house. So they were doing the whole life cycle thing. Just like people who live up on Mount Tam, they get like a whole deer family and there's babies on the property, and you've got the whole wild America thing happening. So the main things that we deal with are browsing. That's deer are not just going for food, but for water. So when we talk about what do you plant that deer won't eat, I mean, there are general, rules of thumb that don't always work out, but are probably almost more helpful than the plant lists, because those are very hit or miss. And that is that it has a strong aromatic quality. If it's thick leathery leaves, if it's got spines on it, if it's toxic, such as oleander or anything in the Solanaceae family, like potatoes, or Brugmansia, like the flowering datura, or something that is truly toxic. But the aromatic stuff, thorns, and then thick leathery leaves, generally are things that they'll stay away from at least until later in the year when they're really desperate. And I think alliums, in general, things that are like chives and onions, they won't necessarily go after. The stuff that they love, it's a long list. It's like you said, Jen, like they will go after a younger olive tree, because if you have to remind yourself, because they're also going for water, they'll go for landscapes more than any native plants, because we're irrigating things. So it's got a lot higher water content than something that is on the same hillside in the same area.
And the babies generally, and the babies will eat stuff that the adult deer won't eat, because they don't know that they're not good for them, toxic. So they'll come and take a bite. I've seen that too.
Totally. I like the idea of, I don't know how well it works in, again, a really big garden, but if you had a bed that you were specifically trying to grow edibles in, I like the idea of planting stuff around the edge that they won't eat, like chives or garlic or onions or potatoes or peppers, which are also in the Solanaceae family, and just kind of seeing if you can deter them in that way. I don't know, again, if it's going to work. If you live literally like up on Mount Tam, you're going to they're going to try stuff anyways. That's just the way it is. But I do like the idea of planting like a little border around something if you truly can't fence it in for varying reasons. The difficult thing about fences, which we haven't gone into, is that everywhere you have a fence, you have to have a gate, because wherever you pass through the fence, you have to have a gate. So it gets tricky, especially if you live on a hilly property, or if you have, stairs or, ways to get through your landscape, and then suddenly you've got to have gates there. You really have to design for it to a certain degree. You have to do it before you build those paths. It's hard to do after the fact. Not impossible, but it just makes it more challenging. So I think that's part of why a lot of people don't end up wanting to do a big fence. Also, it's obviously costly. So we try to pick from the natives that we know the deer aren't going to eat. And then maybe, in the establishment period, try to spray them for certain lengths of time. That too, I find isn't long-term sustainable, because obviously liquid fence costs a lot of money. It's not cheap. You can make your own. You can do that with eggs. I've heard people using like paprika or cayenne, they'll put cayenne in there with an egg stew and then let it age and be stinky and spray it around. Mint supposedly is also good and it doesn't stink as bad. But if you're not making your own, teas to spray, if you know where they're coming onto the property, or that there's a particular kind of thoroughfare and they're always browsing in one area, to try to just spray that one area, especially through the spring when they're just kind of learning where they're going to go, and try to see if you can redirect their behavior to another area so that, that one little scene that you're trying to grow stuff is more protected. But I do think you just have to be consistent about it. So like whatever the package says, if it's every 2 weeks, you do every 2 weeks. If it rains, you have to do it again. So there's a little bit of work that goes into the whole spraying thing. But I do think
I've
you
seen
can
it work
get stuff
though.
started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can train them.
Yeah.
I've seen
I
it
don't
work with
know.
citrus, spraying
Right.
citrus,
And
and
I don't,
then it trains them, and then they'll leave it alone at a certain point. So.
right. I think as the plant ages and it's less, juvenile and young leaves, they won't go after it as much. I don't know that it works the way that they say it does, where you can like spray across a driveway and then the deer won't cross the driveway. I've never seen that.
Me either.
I've tried to do it, but I don't think they respect that invisible line of egg stink. They just walk right across it. But if you spray it on the plant leaves, obviously, then they'll be protected. So sprays are worthwhile. Just to go over, my general adage is try natives first. There's tons of natives, especially, I have to say, if you're in a sunnier area, that have those aromatic leaves, sages and stuff that can handle a lot of sun and a little bit more drought, and they have the aromatic quality, coupled with native grasses. There's tons of native grasses that do well, and you can do in big kind of naturalistic kind of swaths, and it looks natural, even if it's not maybe it's like the Atlas fescue or something that's not a native, but it's a Mediterranean grass that can handle our climate, so it does well. There are both natives and non-natives that do quite well, that the deer won't mess with for all of the gardens that I've ever taken care of. However, there are natives, like I mentioned, such as the California wax myrtle, the Myrica, which we use as a hedge in a lot of native gardens, or any of the ground covering Arctostaphylos, the Uva ursi, what's the common name? Is that kinnikinnick? I can't remember.
Emerald carpet, that one?
Well, emerald carpet's a variety. There's Pacific mist. There's a bunch of different pretty, low but wide ground covers. Those have gotten hammered in certain gardens where, again, it's just enough deer pressure late enough in the season, and it's the only thing that's irrigated. So they will go after it for the water. So you just kind of have to know, okay, this plant is going to be fine in the long run, but for the first 2 years, every fall, I'm going to spray it with, liquid fence, because the deer are going to get desperate and they're going to come and browse it. And, if they browse it hard enough, obviously it won't come back. Most plants will come back, even if it gets browsed. So some other kind of troubleshooting things. We talked about the orchard trees and other small trees that you might want in the landscape, or even, olives, things that are going to be fine in the long run, but while they're short and young, they have the young leaves and they're irrigated, the deer will go for them. So I really think that temporary protection is kind of the way to go for a lot of those shrubs and trees. And just know that in 2 years you're going to take it all off and they'll be fine, and they'll maybe get teeny bit of browse at the bottom, but nothing life-threatening. I also brought up the fact that sometimes people just have really challenging locations because you are on their buffet route. Maybe they're sleeping in your neighbor's garden and then they go down to the watering hole and you're right on their little Serengeti path, and they're going to browse the heck out of a bed on the corner of your property, and there's nothing you can really do about it. It's good to know what plants will survive there, but it's also good to remember, like, maybe I'm not having a small tree there, maybe I'm going to do a cool sculpture, or I'm going to do like some other focal point element that isn't going to be a delicious thing. It kind of reminds me of when you're in a suburban garden and all the dogs just decide to pee on the one boxwood that's at the corner of your property, and then it's the pee spot for the entire neighborhood. It's like, you know what? It's time to get rid of that boxwood and put a rock there. That's okay to give up on that one boxwood. So there's other things that you can use in the garden to joy and not walk out every morning. They did it again, they went after it again. So, we can get into fence styles if you guys want to. Maybe when we get into Q&A land, people can talk about the specifics. I think basically it comes down to cost. And the reality is that if you have a really big property, it gets really costly to put in a nice looking fence, or relatively nice looking. I like the rigid hog wire, but you have to install it with decent posts, and those posts are not cheap. Putting a bunch of 4x4 redwood or pressure treated posts for a fence that's 150 feet around your property is like, that's money. So I understand that might not always be the best alternative, but what we do sometimes on those bigger properties is, like, you can see in one of these pictures, there's a nice looking kind of industrial looking gate that has rigid hog wire and nice big posts around it. You can do that for just one stretch that you see, and then as it kind of disappears into the landscape, you can opt for something less expensive, like the metal stakes and like the rolled metal fencing, something that you would see on a giant property. It's much easier to install. It's not as long lived, but it's also like way more cost effective. So there's all different ways to think about fencing, but really I think it comes down to money and how hilly these sites are, and how do you really get a fence in that's going to work. It's shaped like this. As soon as you start putting in those posts, you realize, oh, in order for this panel to be tall enough, this post is going to have to be 12 feet out of the ground, because down here it's going to be 6 feet out of the ground. So sometimes the rolled metal fencing, just run at a diagonal that follows the slope, is definitely the most cost effective and easiest to install. So
yeah, and I would also say, just on that point, is like in my own garden, I have just I'm on a half acre, and I just have a small section of it fenced, and that's where I have my edibles and my roses and stuff like that. And then the rest of it is like mostly like native landscape and deer resistant plants. So you can kind of prioritize like an area that can be your fenced in area for the stuff that you want to grow that they would probably eat. Although I do have to say, if that gate gets left open, it's devastating. So
oh yeah, it's
not,
just total heartbreak. Absolutely.
it's complete heartbreak.
Yeah.
But that
Yeah,
is a way
it'll
to
be
just, yeah.
I was just gonna say it'll be right in the spring when everything's budded up and you're like so
I
excited
know.
to see the first whatever and they come
I
in
know.
one
It's
night.
happened.
Yeah, the only thing that I could say is like it could be worse. You know, deer are hard, but they're somewhat more predictable than I think a lot of smaller mammals. Like if you live anywhere in the non-urban part of Marin, you've dealt with possums, wild turkeys, raccoons, and all those guys do weird damage too, and they're harder to fence out. You know, so deer are a little bit predictable. As long as your fence is 6 feet and they can't see through it, you're pretty good. Oh, and you have like a spring hinge on your gate. That's worthwhile.
Totally.
Get like a real gate. You can use the cheap rolled fencing around that, you know, the rest of it, but get a real gate and get a real spring hinge. And then
Yes.
it doesn't matter if your, you know, 8-year-old son leaves the gate open or whatever. So yeah, I've kind of come to the end of just this first part of the presentation. There are other things to scare deer away that, you know, work to varying degrees. I worked on a property in Belvedere for years, like on the weekly doing maintenance, and none of the property was fenced in. And it was partly just the clients didn't believe in it. They didn't want to do it. So we had, you know, little incursions, moments of browsing, but generally we had a good plant palette and they didn't go for stuff. But of course, we had to put a real elaborate fencing around these raised veggie beds that were terraced down the slope. And it took a lot of time to get in there and harvest everything, but we had it all figured out. But I did have on the sort of property line at the edge, I had one of those deer scares that has the motion sensor, which I think you guys sell. I think Sloat sells them.
Yeah.
So it's just like a motion sensor light, but you hook it up to a hose, so it's got water going to it. And, you know, when anybody passes by, it does a, you know, that's supposed to scare them away. And it worked for however long, years. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, we can stomp that. They stomped it like down into the ground, and then they got to all the veggies. So, you know, I think it works. I do think that if you keep them guessing, if you keep it where you maybe move it around every few weeks or something, that can be helpful. They will learn, just they're smart, and so they'll learn where things are and how to get around them. So to remember that, you know, I'm going to do this thing, but I'm not going to get lazy about it and just think that it's going to work forever, because it probably won't.
Have you ever done the give them a water, like have you ever put out bowls of water and stuff? I've heard people like, well, they're just thirsty and that's why they're eating their plants. So I don't know. Some people in Marin are like, if you put out a bowl of water or give them food, then they won't go for the plants. Have you tried that?
I haven't. I really like that idea. It sounds logical. I do also think that it could flip the other way, where you're providing them like a full, complete buffet service. So they have their water source, they have their food, like they're going to come to your house, obviously. So we have, you know, we have gardens that are open, like up in Nevada at the hills at the very edge of like the urban wildlife interface. And we have those kind of like spill water boulder fountains that, and it's like the Serengeti. I mean, all the animals come to their garden, I'm sure, because of the water. And so I didn't think about that when I was figuring out my design and how cool that would look, that all the wild turkeys, all the possums would just come to the garden. And they sucked that water feature dry. I've had to replace the pump like 5 times at that property, because that's where they come. So I like the idea of a water source for the deer. But I think truthfully, they're going to come because of the plants, no matter what, because that is their
Yeah.
natural way of getting water, is by eating the leaves. So I also like that, you know, the Japanese deer scares, the little fountains that fill up a hollow bamboo I should have put an image up of them, but you've seen them in Japanese gardens where they usually have like a little rock that has a indentation on it, and there's a spout of water, and as it fills up, it clonks down onto the rock and makes a little intermittent kind of clonking noise as it fills. Those are supposed to be natural deer scares. I think deer will get used to anything. Once it becomes part of, the background noise, they'll get used to it. It's one thing if you run out into the front of your garden with a hose and, make a loud whooping noise, like that's different. They'll probably be freaked out for a minute, but the little soft, like, it's a cute idea, but I don't know how well it works if you really have a ton of deer around. They probably are like, oh, that's nice. It's a nice song.
Yeah, I think too, looking at, because I think the deer are different in different neighborhoods too. So what they eat in one neighborhood, they leave alone in another. So I think a really good thing to look at is, what are your neighbors getting away with?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because then that's tried and true. Um,
Totally.
and
Yeah.
repeating that, uh, that's helped me a lot actually in my own garden.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I mean, anything aromatic, kind of needly leaves. They will sometimes go for succulents because I think of the water content, but they won't go for like New Zealand flax or, any of those plants. So there's a ton of plants you can plant that they generally are not going to go for. It's just that people are attached to wanting to try stuff that's flowering, that, makes them happy. And if you really don't have any fenced area to kind of give yourself that little safe zone where you do your hydrangeas or your roses or whatever you're excited by, then it's hard, then you feel like you're really missing out. So I'm a big fan of trying to incorporate like a little fenced area somewhere that looks right for your house, that you kind of walk through to get to your house, like a little cottage, potager garden that you can have all your tasty, delicious things in, and then the deer can have the rest. So I'm happy to supply this plant list. Gosh, there's so many plants that should work for you guys, but I tried to winnow it down. It's always difficult. But this plant list will be available, and Jenny can email it to those who desire it. I have it in a PDF form. That's the end. Questions?
yeah, so that's an amazing picture. Way to bring it all together. We'll put her plant list. We can put that in a link underneath the recording, which the recording, I can't remember if I said, but this is being recorded, and the recording will be available on Tuesday, both on our website and on our YouTube channel. No, we don't have questions. I think you covered it. I think honestly, like, we're all just, everybody, we're all trying to see what works for us, and a lot of it's trial and error, and that's true in any garden.
Mhm.
And even in my own garden, they won't touch a plant one year and they'll come and nip at it the next year. So it can change from year to year.
Totally.
But repeating what is working is I think a big tip. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
and just remembering that temporary protection sometimes is all you need, and that once it gets mature, you'll be okay.
Yeah, and that deer fencing, it's sometimes, I don't know, like, it's kind of weird because it's like a thin, like like nylon fencing and stuff like that, but you can drape it over a fruit tree, or you can drape and you don't see it.
Mhm.
Like, you really, you don't see it. So it's not like this glaring plastic ugly thing. It's literally just almost kind of like an invisible barrier around it. And at
Totally.
least it gives them enough protection. And you can even, just on a simple level, if you have a little vegetable, little 4x4 vegetable box, you can do stakes around that with the deer netting, and
Mhm.
that's really a really economical way to do it. I've done that before, and then just had one side of it that I could kind of roll back the fence so I could get into the, harvest the vegetables and stuff like that. So it doesn't have to be a
Elaborate.
big elaborate thing, although those are
Yeah,
nice.
unless you know that like forever and ever you're gonna have a veggie garden in a particular area and you want to commit and have a fence installed, that's great. But if you're not totally sure and you want to just sort of see like, oh, it looks like there's sun over here, I think I'm gonna do some veggies here this year. I
Mhm.
think having the four, even if they're tall bamboo that you can just put in the ground yourself, or metal stakes, whatever you want to use. And then I do the one panel side, same thing, but I usually put an extra bamboo and like do zip ties to that
Oh, mhm.
edge of that panel, so you can literally undo like a twisty tie and take it open. And so it's
Yep.
almost like a flexible door so that you can access it to harvest and stuff like that. You just want to
Mhm.
make sure that you can get in there to harvest. But
Yeah.
we've been deer country gardening for a long time, and I almost don't mind them as much now as I do some of the other critters. they're they're at least like somewhat predictable, whereas the other ones, you're like, well, you just dug that up. What was your plan? What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Like, thanks a lot for nothing. Oh, you're going for grubs. Great, cool.
Yeah. I think I'd take deer over gophers for sure. Go,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
So,
again, predictable, sort of.
mhm. Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
yeah,
great.
I'm open to if you guys need specific questions answered. I think it is tricky because each garden's different. The particular area that you're trying to plant is a little different. Maybe you're looking for a ground cover, maybe you're looking for a tree, but check out the plant list. I think that's a good place to start. And
Yeah, absolutely. And
if
obviously,
you have a particular problem area.
yeah, and any slow garden center, if you come in, I think of our stores have a deer resistant area that we can direct you to and show you different plants. And we do have, like Emily was talking about, we do have the liquid, the sprays and things that are good. Like in a deer area, when we put in a new landscape, even if it's all deer resistant plants, I'm always like, let's put down some repellent, because you just
Yeah.
it's new, it's exciting, they want to come check it out, so put
Mhm.
out some repellent for a couple weeks when you first do a landscape, just to sort of like, you
Totally.
know train
Yeah,
them and just detour them, because it is so fresh and enticing. So,
that is a good point. Totally.
well, great, thank you so much.